Basically, it took us kind of 5 years to build out the full value proposition that the customer wanted: simplified shoe design experience, fast delivery, and not charging a premium. And we grew over that period. We grew from sort of 2 million a year, 2.5 million a year revenue to about 12 million. 5xing your business is, in theory, sort of good, but we needed to be at 20 to 30 million revenue to be breaking even. And based on the volume of customers we're having getting to the website, we should have been at 100 million revenue had the value proposition have worked properly. So at 12 million revenue, it was pretty clear the value proposition wasn't working for this mass market fashion customer.
Hi everyone, welcome to episode 111 of the Startup Playbook podcast. I'm your host Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they used to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. I am delighted to have Michael Fox, the co-founder and CEO of Fable Food Co, as my guest for this episode. Michael started his career as a lawyer before jumping into tech, launching Shoes of Prey as the co-founder and CEO in 2009. Fast forward 9 years and the company had grown to over 200 staff, had raised $35 million in VC funding from some of the leading funds from around the world, and had developed partnerships with the likes of David Jones and Nordstrom. However, despite growing from $2.5 to $12 million in revenue and being loved by a niche community of creators, they weren't able to break into the mass consumer market, and as a result had to shut down the business in mid-2018. Michael is now back with his second startup as the co-founder and CEO of Fable Food Co, which turns mushrooms into delicious tasting meat alternatives, and is backed by some of the investors that joined him on the Shoes of Prey journey. We covered a range of topics in this interview, including overcoming obstacles, the need to go deeper into market research, and the importance of maintaining relationships when times get tough. Without further ado, here is my interview with Michael Fox. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to episode 111 of the Startup Playbook podcast. I'm delighted to have Michael Fox from the co-founder and CEO of Fable Food Co as our guest for this episode. Before we jump in, just wanted to give you a quick rundown of how this episode will operate if this is your first time here. So Michael and I will do an interview for the first 45 to 50 minutes, and then we'll jump into audience Q&A. For those of you that are tuning in live, there's a little chat function available if you wanted to talk to some of the other attendees, as well as for any questions that you might have for Michael, which we'll run through for the last 10 minutes of the show. There's a little Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. Also, if you're sharing along today, the hashtag for the event is #PlaybookLive. So thank you all for joining us. And Michael, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast. And thanks so much for taking the time out of your day this morning to join us.
Thanks, Rohit. Good to be here. Yeah.
So Michael, for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
So originally I was a lawyer, worked at Clayton Utz for a year out of university, went to Super Retail Group for a couple of years, kind of did a retail grad program, Google for 2.5 years doing advertising sales, then co-founded Shoes of Prey, and then spent 10 years on Shoes of Prey. So Shoes of Prey was a kind of a fashion technology startup. You could go online and design your own shoes, and then we manufactured and delivered them to you. That was a kind of startup roller coaster ride, which I'm sure we'll go into. Finished up with Shoes of Prey 18 months ago, and have now co-founded a meat alternative company called Fable Food Co. I've been vegetarian for 4.5 years, so it's a space I'm really passionate about.
So there's so much that obviously we'll get to with Shoes of Prey and Fable, but just going back to your previous background, and you briefly touched on this as well, was you started your career as a lawyer. And from my research, I think you were only there for about a year or so.
Yeah.
Well. Do you want to talk a little bit about what was that sort of transition like for you in terms of, I guess, going through education to become a lawyer? I think your last day was on a Friday and you'd just gotten your kind of license a few days prior. Do you want to just kind of talk about what that sort of process was like for you in terms of getting to a law degree, getting a job, and then jumping out?
Yeah, so I studied commerce law at the University of Queensland, and I probably didn't give enough thought, or I definitely in hindsight didn't give enough thought to what I was going to do afterwards. I just sort of went along with, all the different employers who came to university and talked to you, and it kind of seemed to be doing a commerce law degree, you had a choice of being an accountant, a consultant, or a banker or a lawyer. I'd done some internships at accounting firms and didn't like that. I'd explored being an investment banker, and I wasn't particularly interested in that. And it just kind of defaulted to the last one left was being a lawyer. So that's sort of where I ended up. I went to Clayton Utz, one of the big commercial firms, and yeah, like 2 months into working as a lawyer, I realized, oh my God, this is not me at all. Like, I mean, it suits some people. Like if you're introverted and you enjoy sort of deep kind of work, reading legislation and applying it to sets of facts. This is commercial law anyway. Then I'm sure it's interesting, but that's just not me. Like I'm an extrovert. I enjoy hanging out with people and get sort of my energy from other people. And I just realized very, very quickly that that's not what I wanted to do long term. Like I'd get the train home from work and I'd come back in the next morning and have like completely forgotten about what I'd been doing the day before because I just wasn't engaged in it. And on the train, I'd be reading, this maybe shows how old I am, but I'd be sitting on the train reading Business Review Weekly, reading about all startups and people in the business world. And I kind of realized, there's this whole other kind of space that I wasn't really exposed to at uni that's what I'm actually reading about in my spare time. That's what I'm interested in. So that's sort of what prompted me to go then do a grad program at Super Retail Group, which is Super Cheap Auto. Now they've got Rebel Sport and some others. So that was the journey.
Yeah. So like I had a very similar story as well. Like I think I lasted about within my first 3 months of an engineering job, I was like, it's interesting work, but it's not something that I want to devote my life doing.
Yeah.
Trying to tell your Indian parents that you want to leave your engineering job to start a fashion tech startup is an interesting conversation to have. What did that sort of process look like for you? So you mentioned that you wanted to, you were reading about sort of business and tech. What did that process look like for you? You mentioned you kind of jumped into Super Retail Group, and I think you worked at Google for a little while as well. When you kind of know that a legal career wasn't something that you wanted to pursue, what did that next step look like?
Yeah, so I guess I've been reading about all these different companies in the Business Review Weekly, and then I just started kind of talking to my friends and reaching out to people. And I was living in Brisbane and got connected into the CEO of Super Retail Group, so caught up with him for breakfast on a Saturday, just sort of asking, like, messaged him and or back then it might have even been calling him and just asked if he would be willing to have a chat to me, a conversation, because I was not quite sure what I wanted to do and wanted some career advice, and he was happy to catch up and have a chat. And I did a few of those sorts of conversations, and that's sort of that all led me down the path of I'm gonna find this way more interesting than being a lawyer. I should go do this. It was definitely not an easy decision either. But for my parents, maybe not quite as strong as yours. I'm not sure, but they were like, hang on, you've gone and studied a law degree. You want to leave law after? I left after 9 months. Got qualified as a solicitor on the Wednesday, and my last day was the Friday. I already had my Super Cheap Auto job teed up kind of 3 or 4 months before that, but just waited to get my qualifications. But I mean, the good thing about doing it at that point in time, like I had a mentor in the law firm. He was like my assigned mentor, and I remember sitting down with him one day, and he said, "Michael, I think your heart's just not in it being a lawyer. Can I give you one bit of advice? Get out while you still can. I've got a mortgage. I've got a wife. I hate my job. I hate my life, but I can't afford to go and restart my career. So get out while you still can." And that was my mentor in a law firm. So, and he was this kind of short, stocky, balding man. It's like, okay, I don't want to end up in the position that you're in. So that was kind of it was all made it a fairly easy decision, really.
Sometimes it's great to have a mentor like that who can sort of give you an insight into what sort of path you're heading down to help you figure out some insights that may not be as obvious when you're sort of starting off your career.
I need to message him actually and thank him. I just connected with him on LinkedIn last week, so I'm going to do that now.
So Mike, what did that process look like? Obviously, sort of after your experience at Super Retail Group and then at Google, you jumped out and launched Shoes of Prey in 2009. What was that sort of first kernel of an idea that you had around the business, and what did those initial steps look like in turning that idea into something that you wanted to sort of jump into and pursue?
Yeah, I think I'd probably always had this desire to want to start a business, and maybe it wasn't always a conscious thought, um, but I think it was always there. And so, yeah, I did 2 years at Super Cheap Auto, and that was kind of gave me a good overview of retail, like a good sized retail business. I think they're doing about 500 million in revenue at the time, and a couple of thousand employees. So it was big enough that it was like there was lots going on, but not super crazy big. Like it was a good size. I could kind of wrap my head around the business in 2 years, and I kind of worked through all the different departments in the business. So I really liked retail. Then yeah, I could see kind of Google was launching in Australia and taking off. This was sort of 2007. I started at Google, yeah, so I went and did an advertising sales role at Google for 2.5 years. So yeah, super exciting time in the search engine marketing space. As a salesperson, it was the easiest thing to sell because the product worked, and yeah, lots of consumers switching over to using Google at the time, and just yeah, cost per clicks were really low. It was an easy sell, and that was a fun kind of introduction into the whole tech world. And so then yeah, I'd always had this desire to start it. Google grew from about 100 to sort of 300 people in the 2.5 years I was there, and it started, and as a company it grew from 6,000 to 20,000 employees, and just started to become a lot more kind of bureaucratic through that growth phase. Felt less like a small nimble startup and more like a larger company. And so, and it was, you know, the best company in the world to work for, and I wasn't fully happy there because of that bureaucracy. So figured, well, okay, well, yeah, if this is the best company in the world to work for and I'm still not loving it, yeah, maybe I need to go and start one myself so I can structure things, yeah, to how I would want to do it. So then thinking through what I wanted to do, yeah, the retail background and the online background, online retail seemed like a good combination of those things, and could sort of see it was in the earlier days of online retail in Australia, and this was a kind of channel that was going to grow pretty rapidly. So yeah, wanted to start a business in the online retail space. One of my co-founders, we wanted a unique, differentiated product. Didn't want to just be selling something that lots of other people sold. So my co-founder, one of my co-founders, Jody, she'd been designing her own shoes at little stores in Asia, and had lots of her friends asking her to design shoes for them when she would go and do other trips. And so we sort of put two and two together and thought, oh, we want to do an online retail business, want a unique product. No one's really done design your own shoes before. It seems like a really interesting idea. That's kind of what led to it.
And, you know, obviously Shoes of Prey was such an innovative and sort of interesting idea at its time. You know, one of the biggest challenges for a business, you know, it's not as simple as kind of launching a website and sort of letting your customers come to you with Shoes of Prey. You know, you really had to sort of work out your manufacturing side. And I imagine that process must have been difficult as well. And that's actually one of the questions that we received through the registration process from Ziba Pakar, who wanted to know, what was the hardest part of building out that supply chain, especially when you're kind of creating sort of single kind of one-off products in a manufacturing capacity where I guess people are kind of used to bulk ordering or kind of large orders? What did that sort of process look like in terms of setting that up, and what were some of the challenges that you had to overcome?
Yeah, definitely wasn't easy. So yeah, spent a lot of time in Asia meeting with different shoe factories, and exactly like Ziba touches on in her question, most of the conversations that we had with shoe factories were us going to them saying, hey, we're doing custom women's shoes, one at a time shoes. And they'd say, oh, that's interesting. Yes, our minimum order quantity is 10,000 pairs per style. And we'd go back and explain, no, we're doing custom women's shoes. We need to do one at a time. And they said, oh, one, it gets lost in translation. They'd be like, oh, you want 1,000? No, that's too small. No, like, no, we actually just want one. And so most shoe factories didn't want to touch it. So we ended up finding the factories that were manufacturing for the kind of small little custom women's shoe stores in Asia. So there were obviously already factories doing that for these physical stores. So we went and met with them, managed to network our way into them, and they became our first couple of suppliers were manufacturers for those little shoe stores. But they were very kind of small scale, not sophisticated. You know, they were supplying like 3 retail stores, and that was about it. So that was fine for us that we could kind of grow with them for the first sort of 2 years. But we realized after that, if we wanted to scale, there was no one in the world that existed who could make shoes one at a time. So we ended up embarking on building our own shoe factory, and spent the next 5 years doing that. Ended up with sort of 160 employees in China, and developed all our own processes to manufacture shoes one at a time. And sort of got quite good at that operational and manufacturing aspect. But yeah, we had to go do it ourselves basically because it didn't exist.
Yeah. As with most kind of startups, you kind of have to, there's multiple different components. It's not just about you sort of creating software where people can design your own shoes. It's about sort of working out multiple problems as they come up through the process.
And we didn't realize we would end up down in that direction when we started the business either. We thought it would be just a software kind of problem, and then spend some search engine marketing ads and attract some consumers. And we were pretty naive when we began. And also, I wouldn't recommend like building your own factory unless you absolutely have to, because it adds a whole bunch of complexity into the business. So yeah, if anyone from the fashion space is questioning that, don't, like, if you can work with other suppliers, in my experience anyway, that's definitely a better path. We only did it because we had to.
Kind of speaking of kind of different pathways that you can take for the business or for any business, we've obviously spoken about, and Shoes of Prey is kind of known for raising, I think it was 25 million US, which is about 35 million Australian, from some of the leading investors, both in Australia and overseas. But what maybe not be as common knowledge is that Shoes of Prey was actually bootstrapped for the first 2.5 years. Do you want to talk a little bit, so bootstrapping, self-funded, do you want to talk a little bit about what that sort of process was like in the early days for the company of kind of bootstrapping for the first few years? And again, what that decision-making process was like to kind of finally, pivot your strategy a little bit and focus on fundraising for the business?
Yeah, so we've done, we sort of focused our initial customers that we were drawing in when we launched Shoes of Prey were kind of these passionate creative customers. They read fashion magazines, they had a good sense of their own style, they often worked in creative jobs, and they had the confidence to go and design their own shoes. And for them it was an amazing experience being able to design and create this piece of fashion and be able to wear like this work of art that you've helped co-create. And so we had super high NPS scores. We didn't actually spend much money on marketing. It was mostly kind of word of mouth within this niche. But it was a relatively small niche. And so we'd grown to sort of $2.5 million in revenue a year. And yeah, we were using an external manufacturer to make the shoes. So the business was good. We were able to do that just out of the business's own cash flow. The margins were good. But we had like tens of thousands of customers a day coming to our website and not buying. We had really low conversion rates. And so, we went and talked to these customers, ran online surveys, did focus groups to understand who all these customers were. And what we realized was, we were doing really well, high conversion rates in our little creative niche, but we had all these mass market fashion customers interested in what we're doing and coming to our website, but they weren't buying. And so we asked them, why are you not buying? And they said, look, we love the concept. We want to design our own shoes, but we want a simplified shoe design experience. It's too freeform for us. What we built for the creative people is too freeform. So we want it to be guided through the process. We want sub 2 week lead times. Our creative customer was willing to wait 5 weeks for her shoes. But that mass market fashion customer was often designing for an event coming up. So she wanted sub 2 weeks rather than 5 week lead times. And she didn't want to pay a premium. We were sort of charging a 30% premium over the same quality shoes. And the creative customer was happy to pay that, but the mass market customer didn't want to. So we looked at that and we said, well, we can go and do these things. Like we can simplify the shoe design experience. We can shorten the lead time. We can lower the retail price, but we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to hire some more software engineers and user experience people to simplify the shoe design experience. And we're going to have to build our own factory to reduce the lead times and the unit costs because our existing suppliers are not going to be able to do that. So we looked at that and said, yep, okay, we can do that, but we're going to have to go raise capital because that's going to take a while to set up and it's going to be an investment to set up. So that's when we went out and raised venture funding. So yeah, the goal was to kind of, there's a great book called Crossing the Chasm, which outlines basically exactly what we were doing. We needed to cross the chasm from this niche creative customer, changing our value proposition to meet the needs of this mass market customer. So yeah, that's why we raised the money and that's what we set out to do.
That book, Crossing the Chasm, has been recommended by quite a few guests as well. So I highly recommend for anyone listening to check out that book. I think it's definitely something that's interesting. And to your kind of point about strategically shifting from your sort of early adopters who were sort of hyper engaged, you mentioned that there was very high NPS scores. I remember that in your blog post as well, kind of talking about the review of Shoes of Prey, you kind of mentioned that at the very early stages, you had such a tight knit and hyper engaged community of customers that absolutely loved that product. What did that sort of transition look like in terms of trying to scale that out? Because that obviously becomes really challenging when you're doing that, especially if you're kind of shifting out to a mass market sort of consumer. What did that process look like for you after you'd fundraised to try and reach out to that market, or sort of expand out sort of Shoes of Prey's sort of community to that audience?
So it involved a bunch of things. So a big part of it was the operational side of expanding out the software engineering team, user experience team, and then kind of constant iteration on the design process to improve and simplify the design process. And ultimately we went from a very free-form creative process to one where you could shop a range of shoes like you would on a normal shoe website. And then you could select a shoe and then you could modify that shoe. Maybe you wanted to lower the heel or change the color, or make it a pointed toe instead of a round toe, or you could go and modify those designs. So that was one process, sort of, and a lot of kind of research and talking to the mass market customer about how she wanted to do that process, and then building it. Building our own shoe factory in China. I mean, that was a massive undertaking. It took us about sort of 4 or 5 years to go from start to, ultimately we got our delivery times down to averaging 11 days in our last year, from when you placed an order anywhere in the world to when you received your custom pair of shoes. And we brought the unit costs down, so we brought our retail price down by 30%. So we weren't asking people to pay a premium for our service. And that was a massive undertaking. Hiring shoe experts in China, leasing a building, equipment. You could talk for days just about what we had to do to make that happen. Ultimately over that, and then we did partnerships with David Jones in Australia and Nordstrom in the US. So we wanted to get the product in front of where mass market customers were shopping for fashion shoes, and that's one of those places in department stores. So you could go into David Jones or Nordstrom onto the women's shoe floor, and you could design shoes on iPads, and then order them, and we would deliver them. So we were kind of there in front of the mass market customer. And basically it took us kind of 5 years to build out the full value proposition that the customer wanted: simplified shoe design experience, fast delivery, and not charging a premium. And we grew over that period. We grew from sort of 2 million a year, 2.5 million a year revenue to about 12 million. But we didn't grow anywhere near as much as, that was good growth. 5xing your business is, in theory, sort of good, but we needed to be at 20 to 30 million revenue to be breaking even. And based on the volume of customers we're having getting to the website, we should have been at 100 million revenue had the value proposition have worked properly. So at 12 million revenue, it was pretty clear the value proposition wasn't working for this mass market fashion customer. And now we built it, we could watch how the consumer behaved on our site. And what we realized was this mass market fashion customer, consciously, she thinks she wants to customize. Like if you ask her and if you talk to her, she loves the idea of being able to design her own shoes. It's something she consciously thinks she wants to do, but deep down, subconsciously, she doesn't really have the confidence to design her own shoes, and she doesn't really want to invest the time to do it. She really just wants to read fashion magazines or see what's popular on Instagram and buy that exact shoe, and even that brand. And this is a subconscious thing that she can't necessarily articulate, so it didn't come out in our surveys and our focus groups. What she subconsciously wants to be basically shown what to wear by brands and designers is pretty much the antithesis of what she consciously thinks she wants, which is to design her own shoes. We built this value proposition which was kind of the opposite of what she really wanted. It was a failing in our market research that we didn't get down to that deep down subconscious of what the consumer actually really wants. We missed that in our research, and cost our investors $25 million US and me 10 years of my life and a whole bunch of people on our team. So yeah, stuff in between. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, kind of diving a little bit deeper into that market research piece, like if you go to startup weekends or if you're part of any form of Facebook groups where entrepreneurs hang around, there's always, a range of different surveys that people push out for their new business idea. And for the most part, I think getting market research is important, but often people don't ask the right questions or kind of get that right insight. And as you said, sometimes it's not as simple as just because that's what consumers are saying, that's what they actually mean. I guess, is there a process or kind of a learning that you've taken in terms of decoupling what people are saying their intentions are versus how they will actually behave if put in a situation?
So, I mean, in my experience, the best thing is to be able to watch how consumers behave and then ask follow-up questions. Like once we built the value proposition, we could then watch how customers were behaving on the website or in person in those department stores. And then we could see that the value proposition wasn't working. We could go and ask them specific questions on different decisions we'd watch them make. And then it was very quick. It was pretty easy then to understand why it wasn't working. But that was really hard. We couldn't really do that because no one had built a women's fashion custom shoe design experience before. So ideally you want to watch how customers behave and ask them, but I don't know how we could have, it would have been difficult to do. That didn't exist with Shoes of Prey, so that wasn't a solution. So with Shoes of Prey, we would have had to get psychologists involved and really deeply try and ask the right questions to understand what was behind the answers consumers were giving us. And I don't know how, I still to this day don't quite know how to do that. This is starting a new business, this is something that keeps me up at night because it was the thing that we got wrong and fatally so for Shoes of Prey. So with my new business, which I'm sure we'll get into, but just specifically on this topic, we're doing a meat alternative. There are already meat alternatives in the supermarket. So I've spent a hell of a lot of time in Coles and Woolworths, just standing at the meat alternative bay, watching consumers shop those products, seeing which products they pick up and put down, seeing which ones they pick up and put in their shopping trolley, and then creepily going and asking them questions about why did you pick that one up and put it down, and they'll give a reason, and why'd you keep that one. And so I've been able to watch how consumers behave and then ask questions about what's going through their mind. And that's been so much easier for this business. But the challenge is, for the fortunate thing from a market research perspective in my new business is that there's other businesses doing meat alternatives. So I can do this. But so if you're trying to do something completely new, market research is hard. If you're evolving something that already exists, then this market research piece is easier. And there's companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods who 5 years ago they were where we were with Shoes of Prey. There weren't really good meat alternatives on the market, so they were kind of forging that path ahead, and they've shown that it can work. So yeah. I don't quite know if you're in that position how to do it, but best thing is, in my experience, watch how consumers behave.
Yeah, like you said, I mean, one example of a question around sort of startup weekends is, everyone, for example, if you wanted to launch a startup around in the fitness space, instead of asking how many times do you intend to go, how many times have you gone to the gym in the last month? A little bit harder now, kind of given the current time period, but it's more, as you said, kind of looking at that habits, and it's a lot easier, obviously, if you've got existing product or competitors in the space and you can see how consumers are behaving. Little bit more difficult if you're doing something for the first time and trying to sort of decouple that. But Michael, I imagine that process must have been really hard for you as well, in terms of, the business was still growing. You still had a really engaged customer base. I imagine your sort of NPS score kind of remained quite high through that sort of process as well. What did that process look like for you to, get to a point that made you realize that, things weren't quite going the way that you wanted them to, or I guess the other problems that you were trying to solve weren't being done quickly enough, or there just wasn't enough adoption taking place in the mass market for you to sort of continue with Shoes of Prey?
Yeah. So yeah, I guess it took us kind of 5 years to execute on the simplified shoe design experience and building our own factory. And through that period, we grew sort of, from 2 to 12 million a year revenue, but not as much as we anticipated that we would grow. And we kind of, it was this really kind of, in hindsight, horrible midpoint of like enough growth that it looked like it had potential and that we should not quit and keep going, but not enough growth to get to break even. And so it was kind of a gradual, it was like ripping off a Band-Aid, but really, really slowly over a few years, where like, okay, it's working enough, we should keep doing it. Maybe it's like we're like right on the cusp of making it work. Maybe these additional things that we're going to do and implement will help. Maybe the whole, okay, we've got our delivery times down to 11 days this year, but our retail prices are still 30% too high. Or our shoe design process is not quite simplified enough. So maybe it's the whole package together is what'll give us the big uptick in growth. If you've executed on 2 of the 3 things people want, that might only get you so far, but you need to do all 3 to get the big uptick. So there was always enough to like still hold on to keep going. But it was still not, nowhere near where we weren't hitting our sales targets through that period. So it was a little bit, it was kind of in this middle zone of it's enough to keep going, but not enough to succeed. And then eventually we kind of finished executing on all the things that the customer wanted. And of course you can still improve things, but we're like, no, this is going back 5 years. This is exactly what the customer wanted. Like we've executed on it, we've delivered it, and we're still not getting the big uptick in sales. So clearly something is wrong. Then we could watch how consumers behave through the whole process and understand that it just wasn't resonating. And so we tried a few pivots. We had some sub niches like wedding shoes, odd sizes, small and large, narrow and wide sizes. We tried to pivot into those niches, as well as, considering, do we just go back and focus on that creative customer that we'd done well in? But none of those niches were big enough to justify all the investment that we made. And the pivots weren't working. So then we looked at selling the business, but it was a very complex business for its size. Like owning and operating a shoe factory in China is a very complex thing. Western fashion brand that's got this design your own shoe experience is a complex thing. Both of those things in the one business. That also made it hard to sell the business. There was a lot, and then there was a lot of interest in the fashion brands, and there was a lot of interest from Western fashion brands who wanted to get into customization. There's a lot of interest in the manufacturing from Chinese manufacturers, but we had like perfect customer and supplier risk. So if you're a fashion brand and bought our fashion business, there was only one factory in the world that could supply you. Western fashion brands don't own Chinese shoe factories normally. So you don't want to own and operate that factory. So if someone else goes and buys that factory and mess it up, then this fashion brand is worthless. And same the other way. You're a Chinese manufacturer, you want to get into customization, here's a factory you can buy. But at the moment, it's only got one customer. You don't know, as a Chinese manufacturer, you've got no idea how to run a Western fashion brand. So if the Western fashion brand, whoever buys that, messes it up, then you've got no customer base. So even selling the business proved really difficult. So ultimately, we just had to shut it down. Ultimately, we have sold the factory and the brand, but it took a lot longer and we had to shut down the business in the meantime.
Yeah, and I imagine it's a difficult conversation and realization to get to for yourself, and also a very difficult conversation to have with all of the other stakeholders. Your investors, your startups, your staff as well. And startups by nature are there's only a very small percentage of companies that go on to be successful and successfully exit for billions of dollars, hopefully. But especially a period like now where we're going through a pandemic has kind of accelerated a lot of the, challenges that kind of companies face. And I'm sure that there's a lot of founders at the moment who are sort of at the crossroads or having to make those sort of difficult conversations or those difficult realizations. What was that sort of process like again for you in terms of having to speak to your investors, who, as you mentioned, had kind of put in $25 million, as well as, I read somewhere that you had I think your second ever employee stuck around over the entire sort of 9 or 10 year journey as well. What was that sort of process like for you in terms of having those conversations and going through that process?
Yeah, I mean, it was painful. And it was a kind of, yeah, like I said before, kind of a gradual, slowly ripping off a Band-Aid, even more painful process. Like, yeah, we had, at our peak, we had sort of 200 employees. As we started to realize things weren't working, we had to reduce the number of employees to, when we moved into those, pivoting into the sweating and sizing shoes, we laid off like 60 or 70 people to give us some extra time and runway, lower our cash burn to be able to operate and to try and make that pivot. So that was a, painful thing to have to go through and lay off those people. And then 3-4 months later, those pivots weren't working. We had to lay off another 50 people, and like doing it in gradual chunks like that was, not enjoyable or pleasant for anyone. I mean, I guess some of the things that made it slightly less painful for everybody was we had a very open, transparent culture. So all the team in the business could see that we weren't hitting our targets and could understand the reasons why. And so then when we had to go and lay people off and explain it to people, everyone understood, and it wasn't a shock to people, which I think made it easier. It can be tempting as a founder, and I felt this temptation and even fell for it sometimes, to like want to put on a positive, happy, this is all going well, keep everyone motivated and pumped up face. But in my experience, people can see the numbers, they can see what's happening. So then you just kind of look like a bit of a, like, are you like living in reality? People know what's going on. So it's in my experience anyway, works out much better to be open and transparent with people. So that kind of helped through that process. And it was similar with our investors. Like they were all kind of venture capital investors. Their whole business model is invest in 100 businesses, 2 or 3 of them turn into unicorns, and that's where they make the majority of their money. Another 20 will do well, another 20 will return the capital, and maybe 30 to 50% go bust and they lose their money. So they're very conscious that happens. Again, we were open with them the whole way. They could understand that they were on board with the strategy that we were implementing, which didn't work. So they could see it was those issues, and not some other it was a failure in our market research, but it wasn't a failure in execution and in lots of other areas. So yeah, painful. In parts of it made more painful by the fact we'd moved our headquarters from Sydney to Los Angeles. 23 people had moved over with us. So, they're some of my close friends. So having to lay off people who've moved to the other side of the world with you, who are your close friends, that sucks for everybody. As you touched on, our second employee that we'd ever hired had been with us for pretty much the entire 10 years. Having to lay her off in China, those things are obviously painful and difficult. We're still really good friends with the majority of those people. Some of them are working for me in my new business. Some of the investors have invested in my new business. So yeah, there's ways to. It was painful, but there's ways to do it so that it, everyone gets it, and while it's painful, it's everyone's understanding of it. If you do it okay.
Yeah, I know from my own experience, so much of your identity gets tied to your startup as well, and it can be really difficult to sort of uncouple from that and kind of separate out who you are as a person with the business that you've been running and kind of essentially your baby for the last sort of 9-10 years of your life that you put everything into. What did that process look like for you from, I guess, post having those difficult conversations and then having to sort of separate out from Shoes of Prey and sort of finding out what was next? What did that process look like? Do you have any advice in terms of what sort of helped you get through that period?
Yeah, so definitely, like my identity was totally tied up in Shoes of Prey, like my self-identity and my career and public identity, I guess, too. Well, not that was big or anything, but at least in the startup space. So that was tough. You have this dream of what your startup's going to be. You spend 10 years on it, and you sell all these employees and investors into the vision, partners, and then it doesn't play out like that. That felt awful. No real other way to describe it. I think some of the things that helped me through that period, in some ways I was fortunate that my first child was born about a year before we closed Shoes of Prey. So kind of right in the thick of all of this And I think that helped give me perspective on like life and where Shoes of Prey kind of fits into life more broadly. And, you know, having a child just kind of just brought all of that into perspective and realized like he's healthy, my wife's healthy, I'm healthy. Like that's 100 times more important to me than my career. So, you know, even though the career bits is tough, this other family side of my life is wonderful. So I think that helped. The journey of then working through all of that. So I took 6 months off after we closed Shoes of Prey. My wife was pregnant with our second child, actually also making it more difficult. My visa was tied to, US visa was tied to Shoes of Prey. My wife was 7 months pregnant. So when I stopped working for Shoes of Prey, I had 60 days to either get another job or leave the country. We pretty much had to leave within 10 days because Katrine wasn't going to be able to fly anymore. And we risked getting stuck in the US without visas, giving birth. Like, it would have been a disaster. So we ended up flying to Denmark because my wife's Danish. So she had healthcare there. And then we lived in Denmark for the next 6 months. And I just took the 6 months off. Like I meant for my own mental health, I needed a break from that whole experience, and just needed time to time out being a dad and just doing whatever the hell I wanted to do. You know, I hadn't really had a proper holiday in 10 years. And it was just it was awesome, like really nice time to just switch off. And then I ended up, and in hindsight for my career and what I'm doing now, it ended up being a really pivotal 6 months for me. I ended up just reading wherever my intellectual curiosity took me, and that was in a whole bunch of different areas. But one of them was because I've been vegetarian for 4.5 years. One of those areas I ended up reading more about was industrial animal agriculture and alternative proteins. And through all that reading, just got very passionate about the idea of wanting to help contribute to ending industrial animal agriculture. And then, started thinking through, well, okay, if that's what I want to do, how might I best apply my skills to do that? And that's kind of, what ultimately led me down the path of starting a meat alternative company, and has led to Fable. So I think if, like, touching on, going back to your question of like, this coronavirus period is disrupting a whole bunch of businesses. There's probably a lot of startups that are either at the wall now and may go under through all of this. I guess in my experience, like, I guess what I'd share with people going through that is, like it feels like that's your whole world at the time. But in my experience, like it's not. Like, family and health is far more important than your startup, no matter how much your kind of personal, your own person is tied into it. And then I wrote a blog post at the start of last year titled 2019, the best year of my life. It literally was the best year of my life. And that was a function of, I finished up with Shoes of Prey mid-2018, took the second half of 2018 off, moved back to Australia at the start of 2019. We moved to the Sunshine Coast, which is where I am now. So living at the beach, wife and 2 kids, really happy family life. Yeah, really, really happy with where we're living. And then starting a business in a category that I'm really passionate about, and being back in that kind of early stages of a business. Like, I went from, some of probably the hardest year of my life in the lead up to closing Shoes of Prey, 6-month transition period, to what was literally the best year of my life. So at least in my experience, like, there is light at the end of the tunnel through it all, and it's possible to turn things around quite quickly, even though in the moment it may not feel like it.
100%. So Michael, kind of shifting gears to Fable and kind of the journey of, I guess, getting that business up and running as well. I know we spoke a little while ago in terms of what that process looked like for you when you sort of moved back to Australia. And from what I gathered, your intention wasn't to start another company necessarily.
Yeah.
From memory, you were sort of you were speaking to a couple of kind of scale up startups, and then you sort of decided to interview for some of the existing, Beyond Meat and Impossible Food as well, which you touched on earlier. Again, what did that sort of process look like from you in terms of deciding, actually, this is, I want to sort of shift gears and kind of focus on something that I'm really passionate about, to then sort of launching another company, Fable Food, and what did that process look like?
Yeah. So no, good question. So, and I kind of glossed over that before. So in the 6 months that I had off in Denmark, got very passionate about the alternative protein space, but I think I still had some, like, I don't know, mild PTSD or something out of the Shoes of Prey experience. Like actively didn't want to start another business. Wanted to go work for someone else for a couple of years. I think my confidence was down. It had just been such a stressful period. Like literally the thought of starting another business made me feel physically ill. And so, yeah, I went and I talked to Beyond and Impossible, to kind of big US companies in the alternative protein space. They weren't hiring in Australia. We wanted to move back to Australia. Then I started reaching out to all the alternative protein companies in Australia. They were all super early stage startups, didn't need someone with my skill set. So there clearly wasn't any jobs in the alternative protein space at the start of last year. That I could go and do at least. So I then started all right, okay, I don't want to start another company, so I'll go interview with some businesses in other, maybe I could go back to Google or some, scale up sort of Series B, Series C stage companies come in as like a COO or something like that. So I did some interviews with companies like that, and that just also made me feel physically ill. Like Google was great. I had a great experience, but I didn't want to go back to a big company like that. And then talking to these scale ups, like they just weren't in categories that I was passionate about. I talked to a few fashion companies, and I was never passionate about fashion in the first place. So even though that's where I'd been operating, it's just not what I wanted to do with my life. Try and build another fashion brand. And so, I kind of hit this decision point where it's like, well, I want to go in the alternative protein space, but I don't want to start a company. I want to work for someone else, but I don't want to do it in any other category. So I moved back to Australia, and I kind of rationalized it by telling myself, all right, start a company in the alternative protein space, but through that, you're going to meet everyone in the category in Australia now that I was back here. And maybe a job will come up. And so I went down the path of starting Fable, met everyone in the category. I started Fable in December 2018, January 2019. A job did kind of come up by sort of June, July last year, but by then I was like, all right, I've hit the point where I think Fable is going to work. I'm excited about it. I don't have that ill feeling again. I have that excitable feeling. So ended up running with it.
Obviously, launching a company is challenging at the best of times. Shifting from, I guess, being a former lawyer to running a fashion tech company to then jumping out into an alternative meat space is not the most common trajectory that people follow. But again, what did that sort of process look like in terms of you going, you know what, actually, this is where kind of my true passion lies, and I think there's something really unique in what we're trying to build with Fable. To kind of identifying and bringing on the right sort of people, skill sets, investors on to help you kind of turn that vision into something real.
Yeah. So no, good question. So I mean, I think for my role in Shoes of Prey and my role in Fable, there's a huge overlap between the skill sets required. It's building a consumer brand. It's manufacturing, logistics, retail partnerships, B2B partnerships, and all the business development behind that, fundraising, hiring a team, building a culture. Like all of those things are identical between Shoes of Prey and Fable. There's some obvious differences around the product. Fashion is different to food on the product side. And there's some nuanced differences. Manufacturing shoes is quite different to manufacturing food. Cold chain logistics for food, ambient logistics for fashion. So there's some differences, but I'd say 80% of what I do day to day is the same. There are those product parts of the business though are very different. So my co-founders in Shoes of Prey, different because they were more the product people, different skill set to my co-founders in Fable. So after wanting to start this business, obviously I have no background in food other than, I love cooking and bake my own sourdough and brew my own water kefir and things like that. So I'm quite into all of that, but as a complete amateur, like I've never done it professionally. So I went out and talked to a whole bunch of people in the food space, and that led me to meeting my two co-founders who are very, very technical in the category that we're in. So Jim he was a chef for 10 years. went and studied chemical engineering and agricultural science. He majored in mycology, which is mushroom science, and then he's worked as a mycologist for the last 12 years, and is just so incredibly passionate about mushrooms and the cooking of them and the science of them. And then Chris McLaughlin co-founded Australia's largest organic mushroom farm. He was Organic Farmer of the Year and Young Farmer of the Year in Australia in 2018. And so he's been in the mushroom space most of his career as well. And so just to backtrack a little bit, the path that I wanted to go down with Fable, in thinking through the kind of product I felt that there was a space in the market for, I wanted to do a different type of meat to burgers and minced beef, because lots of people have done that, Impossible Beyond and plenty of others. And then secondly, wanted to do a really natural, healthy, whole food based meat alternative. Like I shop at my local farmers market, still a lot of my own cooking. I try to eat a really minimally processed diet. So I wanted to kind of do a meat alternative that matched that same sort of ethos. And so that led me down the path of, I went and talked to a bunch of people in the food industry. A lot of people told me maybe try exploring mushrooms as a base. Like, they're really healthy. They've got a lot of those umami, meaty flavors in them. No one's really turned that into a meat alternative. So and exploring mushrooms, that's what led me to meeting Jim and Chris, and perfect kind of complementary skill set for what we were all wanting to do. And they'd been experimenting with some mushroom based meat alternatives as well. So they bring that technical skill that's needed for a food business trying to turn mushrooms into meat. And whereas the kind of technical people we had in product people we had in Shoes of Prey were obviously very experienced shoe people, the equivalent of Jim and Chris, but with shoes rather than food. So for me, the skill sets of the kind of CEO role are actually, there's a lot of similarities between Shoes of Prey and Fable, which is means we can kind of can take all the learnings from Shoes of Prey and apply them into Fable.
Final question for me before we switch over to audience Q&A. So again, a reminder for anyone that's kind of tuning in, and if you've got questions for Michael, please submit them through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. So Michael, again, finally, you mentioned that some of your previous investors with Shoes of Prey have kind of jumped in and joined you with your new company, as well as people that used to work for you at Shoes of Prey as well have also joined the new company. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, the importance of having those relationships in place and maintaining them even through the difficult components? I think it's a lot of investors specifically kind of talk about, it's easy to support a founder through the easy periods, but the challenging part is what happens when things go wrong, and how do you keep sort of, when you talk about backing founders, how do you keep backing them through kind of multiple iterations? What did that, again, any advice that you have in terms of how to foster those relationships and just make sure that you're sort of surrounding yourself with the right people?
Yeah, I mean, that both of those things that you touched on there are like been deeply kind of, I can't quite think of the word, like maybe a relief is actually almost the word, like a relief that my Shoes of Prey investors, I lost them a lot of money, but a relief that they don't blame that on me, and kind of they're they've seen the lessons that I've learnt and are willing to back me again. And same with some of our former Shoes of Prey employees. We've got we're three in Fable. We're three co-founders and 3 employees. 2 of those employees are ex-Shoes of Prey employees, and I've got a bunch more that I'm keeping in contact with to hire in when the time is right. So that's been like deeply, relief, rewarding, confidence boosting, I suppose, from where I'd kind of come from through the troughs after Shoes of Prey. And I guess that's like reflecting on it. It's kind of a function of, we did in Shoes of Prey, we did do a lot of things right. We got obviously some big fatal things wrong, but we did do a lot of things right. And the investors and the employees kind of saw that. So I think that's I guess a takeout from me through that is, even in the tough times, like if you can treat people well, like even letting go of employees, there's good ways to do that and there's bad ways to do that. Actually, if people were in the midst of having to work through that, Brian Chesky, the founder of Airbnb, they just had to lay off 25% of their workforce, and he published they published the letter, or basically the presentation that he gave to the team, that they were the whole Airbnb team, and it's an outstanding letter. Like or a speech that he gave. Like that's the way to do it as a founder. Like firstly, do it yourself. He was kind of mapped out the conversations he was going to have with different teams around the world, and he's going to be up at midnight, or he was up at midnight talking to people in different time zones, and just the openness, the transparency. I think a couple of the things that we did well with Shoes of Prey that they've also done. They've done the same thing. Is like so for example, we had a lot of Australians in the US who are on visas. So getting laid off is made even more difficult because you may have to move country. And so we had everything prepped for people. So all the kind of documentation on what it meant to be laid off. Here's how, if you need to apply for unemployment benefits, here's how that works. With your visa, here's all the details of how that works. And you've got 60 days to find another role. Here's a reference letter from the company talking about what you did in your time in the company. And we're happy to be a referee. It's not your performance that you're getting laid off from, it's the company kind of sharing all of that kind of stuff. And so I think that, and then me having the conversations with the people, the whole team, and the people that we were laying off, rather than palming that off to a HR manager. I think all of those things helped to, people could see the empathy and see the effort that we'd gone to do those things. That's how we did it, and I think that I think there's not much of that process that I would actually change. I think we did a decent job of that. So keeping just treating people well through the whole process, I think then helps, in my experience anyway, helps mean that they're willing to kind of work with you again, and helps build you a good network that can be useful for other things that you're doing, as well as just being the right thing to do.
The first question from the audience comes from Cameron Ralph, who said that he would love to hear Mike's thoughts on the rise of plant-based proteins in the USA due to the current meat shortages, whether you see an opportunity there for Fable, and whether you think this opportunity will continue to last.
Yeah, good question. And I'll talk about this for days, but I'll try and narrow in on a few things. So, coronavirus is absolute tragedy, human disaster, and economic disaster. It's been predicted for a long time that something like this is going to happen. Most of these pandemic type diseases actually come from our mistreatment of animals and putting animals into take for example coronavirus. There's still some debate, and we need to do some more research and to understand where it came from. But it's it's similar to other past viruses that have been close to becoming pandemics, but not quite. So SARS, and also swine flu and bird flu, for example, sort of 10 years ago. Swine flu came from pig factory farms in South America. Bird flu came from chicken factory farms in Asia. Basically, you put a whole bunch of the same species of creature in a confined environment, you're going to get disease spread. Viruses and bacteria will evolve in that environment, and then eventually some of those jump to humans and infect us. So it's another good indication that we need to stop, particularly heavy industrialized animal agriculture, or we're going to keep getting potential pandemic viruses and evolving. So one way to help reduce our animal meat consumption is to eat meat alternatives. So it's another good kind of another good reason, along with carbon emissions, land use, and ethics, to reduce meat consumption. So I think more people are realizing that it's another reason that people are coming around to realizing that we need to reduce our meat consumption. So I think that's going to help push more people into that kind of flexitarian segment who still love the taste and texture of meat and might still eat some meat, but they want to reduce their meat consumption. And then the second thing that the in the question is around closures in abattoirs. So abattoirs, you got a whole bunch of animals in a packed environment, and you got a whole bunch of people in a packed, close, confined environment. And we've seen, I think almost every continent now has had significant abattoir closures. You know, we've got in Melbourne, there's an abattoir that's had a whole bunch of coronavirus spread within workers. There's heaps in the US. There's now some in Germany too, some in South America. So even the working conditions for people in an abattoir are, you know, conducive to disease and virus spread. And so, yeah, meat prices, Australia's not too bad so far, but meat prices are spiking in the US. Meat prices in Asia have been spiking because there's been African swine flu, which has gone through the pig population. China normally has at any one time about 700 million pigs in kind of going through the industrial farming process. That's halved over the last year because of African swine fever. So pork prices have gone up in Asia. That's meant we're now exporting more of our pork from Australia. So pork prices are up in Australia. So all of that, just basic economics is as prices go up, you know, people can't afford. There's not as much supply available, and people can't afford to buy those products. So people are going to be starting to look for alternatives. So that's going to also drive sales in the alternative protein space. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's for so many reasons, it's a no-brainer for people to reduce their meat consumption. Just some of the other stats, we use 47% of the world's land mass is devoted to animal agriculture, and the two big uses are like grazed farming animals. But the other big use that people aren't necessarily aware of is that more than half the world's crops that are grown are actually fed to animals. So if you have a factory farm full of animals, you've got to feed those animals somewhere. The pig takes 8 kilograms of feed to produce 1 kilogram of pork. So if you've got 100,000 pigs alive in a factory farm, you need a huge amount of plants to be grown on farmland to feed those pigs. So yeah, literally 47% of, and this is a UN Department of Agriculture figure, 47% of the world's land mass devoted to animal agriculture. 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions come from animal agriculture. It's more than cars, boats, and planes, all of transport combined. Yeah, what we're doing with particularly the heavy industrial parts of animal agriculture is just insane. And I think this coronavirus is just shining a little bit more light onto that, which will help drive the alternative protein space.
Just mindful of time, final two quick questions from the audience. So one is from Jessica Kehoe, which is, where do you see the future of online retail heading, especially, I guess, in a post-COVID environment?
Yeah, I think that's another industry that's kind of received transition's been happening away from bricks and mortar retail to online retail. I think coronavirus has sped that up by 2 or 3 years. You're seeing that in all categories, from fashion to food. Yeah, seeing it in food as well. You know, like meal delivery companies like Marley Spoon and HelloFresh. They're hitting numbers now that they hadn't planned to hit for about 3 years' time. So I think it's going to, categories like we're using Zoom now for this call. I think there's a whole bunch of sort of online focused businesses, online retail, online video conferencing, that are, their growth charts are going to be sped up by a good couple of years through all of this.
And final question. So I was fortunate enough to get a sample of the Fable brisket last night, which was delicious. But for anyone that's listening, where can they get their hands on them? And I think you've got an announcement coming out in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah. So we're in some restaurants around the country, and you can see those on Fable Food Co. We just launched into Harris Farm in New South Wales 2 weeks ago. So you can buy Fable in 15 of the Harris Farm stores, and you can see which ones on our website. And then in the second week of June, we're launching into 600 Woolworths stores. So so if you're in Melbourne, Rohit, you'll be able to pick up some more Fable in Woolworths in the second week of June.
Absolutely, congratulations on that on that big deal as well. And I'll make sure that I add a link to your website into the show notes. Michael, once again, thank you for taking the time to be on the show and for sharing your experience, story, and insights from both Shoots of Prey and for Fable. And thank you for everyone tuning in to the podcast today as well. Just a quick note before we jump off is As I mentioned, this is part of a new weekly series that we're launching for the show where we go live every Tuesday at 8 a.m. So next week we have Mark Tanner, who is the co-founder and CEO of Quilla, which is reimagining PDF documents. They recently raised a $10 million Series A round from Skip Capital, Airtree, as well as Typeform co-founder. So it should be a fascinating discussion. We're going to be talking everything about sort of fundraising to developing sales and remote teams. So if you'd like to join us, we go live Tuesday, 19th May at 8 a.m. And I'll share a link to everyone that's registered for this episode. But Michael, once again, thank you for taking the time, and hope you all enjoyed the interview.
Yeah, thanks, Rohit. Cheers. Good chatting to you.
Cheers. Bye. Thank you for listening to episode 111 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As always, full show notes from this interview will be available at startupplaybook.co. I'll be back at 8 a.m. next Tuesday, the 19th of May, when I will be going live with our next guest on this podcast, who is Mark Tanner, the co-founder and COO of Quilla. Quilla recently completed their $10.8 million Series A round from Skip Capital, Airtree, and the co-founder of Typeform, Robert Munez. In the interview, we'll be diving deep on building sales teams, some of the lessons and the growth strategies that they've used to date, as well as their funding journey so far. Until then, if you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.